Good afternoon. Excuse me for my English, it isn't good because I have asked to help me Yogandik, who presents in this hall. So, the fate of the population of all occupied territories during the Second World War was not easy. They had to work for the occupiers, live according to occupiers' laws, and fulfill their demands. The fate of Mennonites residing in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union was similar. But there was something which made their life under the condition of occupation ever more difficult. They turned out to be between the devil and the deep sea. On the one hand, there was the country where they and their ancestor lived about 150 years. They already considered this country to be their homeland. On the other hand, there were representatives of their ancestral home, with many of whom they were binded with blood ties. The complicacy of the situation where both the Mennonites and all the inhabitants of the occupied territories proved to be aggravated by the fact that people were uncertain. The front has left, it was unknown where it is, what is going on there. The occupation authorities, the mass media reported about the successful German military advances, that Moscow had already been taken and the troops are moving on. As a result, one part of the population perceives the fascist troops with happiness, with certain hopes, the other part with hostility. Most of the people treated the invaders with passive expectation at the beginning of the war. This ambiguousness explained by the fact that significant part of the population was subjected to various repressions and harassment by the Soviet authorities or was dissatisfied with the existing system. They had their hopes on better change with German advent. To some extent, it was also explained by the difficult financial situation of Germans and Mennonites, either during the war or before the start. So, there was a report about the investigation of the colonies in the Halbstadt area in October 1942. It was made by Karl Stump's special team, Representative Paul Bousset. The report proclaimed that the situation of the Germans is catastrophic, as in all things. There were not enough clothes, linen, shoes. I am convinced that if it's possible to get clothes and shoes from the empire and distribute it among the Germans, that they will be deprived of great worries. I believe then they will have more strength to overcome the distress caused by the past, and especially during the last year. To find the place in the war between Germany and the Soviet Union became one of the main Mennonite tasks. It was also important to decide what to do and how to be in deal with this situation. Mennonite settlements, which had been created since the end of the 18th century, were concentrated on the territory of Ukraine. So, the question of this report will be about the Mennonites of Ukraine. Two of the four mother groups of the Mennonite settlements were located in Ukraine. They were Khortytsa and Molochna, and their territories were occupied. We should note that one of the most serious problems associated with studying of the situation of Mennonites during the Second World War is that neither Soviet nor Nazi statistic designated them as any particular group. The social criterion was the main one in the Soviet Union, and the Mennonites were considered to be only representatives of a social group, mostly peasants. The confession factor was not taken into account. The nationality of the population was also taken into account. However, Mennonites were considered as the German in statistics. The Nazi authorities brought to the fore national affiliation. In that regard, the Mennonites were primarily treated as the Germans, but not as the representatives of any particular community. Furthermore, the Mennonites identified themselves either as Germans or Dutchmen. It's enough to recall the period of the First World War in different conditions at different periods of history, depending on necessity. They also indicated German nationality in various documents, passports, military tickets, questionnaires. We can identify them only by the indicative Mennonite surnames in documents. Correspondingly, for the Nazi occupation authorities, the Mennonites were Germans, and all the rules of law they concerned the German population were extended to them. For some part of Mennonites was no the question about the occupation authorities' relations. It was already solved by the USSR authorities. The point is that the part of the Mennonite population was deported even before German troops' arrival. This process had a few stages, and it was regulated by various decisions of the authorities. It was carried out under different signs, such as evacuation, eviction of socially dangerous areas, mobilization in construction battalions, etc. Also, everything was finished in the way that everyone became a part of the labor army, Trudarmia. The list of the laborers who were kept in such large camps as Bogoslovlak, ITL, Bakalstroy, Chelyab-Metallurgstroy, contain a large number of Mennonites deported from Ukraine. On September 22, 1941, GKO resolution number GKO 702 SS on the resettlement of Germans from Zaporozhye, Stalin, and Varoslavgrad regions was adopted. It was just about the region where the Mennonites lived. As a result, according to the inquiry of the Department of Special Resettlements of the USSR NKVD of December 25, 1941, more than 32,000 people were resettled from the Zaporozhye region. The deportation plan was not implemented because of the rapid attack by German troops. It was not possible to organize the exploitation of the whole population. By the time the decision was taken, many areas with German population were already occupied. As a result, only people who lived on the left bank of Dnieper River were able to have been taken out. On the right river bank, almost all Germans stayed as their place of residence. As a result, the Mennonites of the Khortytsa colonies and their daughterly settlements, Nikolaevfeld, Borozenka, etc., remained in the occupied territory. The Mennonites of the Molochna colonies were mostly deported. Besides the fact of deportation, we should also take into account that many old Mennonite settlements didn't stay the same. That was a result of numerous population migrations before the war beginning. Thus, for example, report number 7, made by Stump and dated back to February 1942, gives an assessment of German and Mennonite settlements condition in Dnipropetrovsk district. Stump says, Kronzgarten was a purely Mennonite colony. Today, remnants from various German villages, mostly from Yuzovstal, live there. Mennonites moved to America in 1921. They were partly expelled by the Bolsheviks in 1930. With the occupation policy implementation, the leadership of Nazi Germany has certain hopes about ethnic Germans and Mennonites. They were to some extent supposed to assign the role of a kind of fifth column, and indeed the organizations of the Germans who supported Nazi Germany plans existed in Romania, Poland, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other countries, even before the beginning of the war, with the purpose of propaganda. Among them, more than 600 strong points of the overseas organization of the NSDAP were established by the end of 1934. Practically all countries where the Germans lived were involved in process. The activity was based on the directive of the Deputy Führer Gess from February 17, 1934. This directive proclaimed the need to unite of all foreign Germans. This goal was defined back in 1920 in the first paragraph of the NSDAP program, which stated, "We demand the unification of all Germans in Great Germany, grounded of the right of people's self-determination." Ultimately, they all had to become Great Germany citizens. The same program of the NSDAP says that only those who belong to German folks can be citizens of the state. Only those in whose veins German blood flows could belong to Germans, no matter what religion they are. Moreover, already at the very beginning of the German war against the USSR in July 1941, an operational headquarters of the rear of the Army Group South, the order was published. Military institutions are obliged to support the resolution of cases concerning Volksdeutsche. Based on these documents, the entire Mennonite population was included into the national list, Volkslist, with further rights and responsibilities. They used questionnaires to make up the list. There were even special points about the respondents' national root confirmation. In particular, the terms of the questionnaires were the next. First, I confirm that none of my parents and my four grandparents, both father and mother parents, did not belong to the Jewish race or faith. Second, I admit that I belong to the Germans. Third, I always recognized, even before June 21, 1941, that I belonged to the Germans. After being included in the national list for them as representatives of the German ethnos, certain privileges were envisaged. Those included special food and manufacturers goods, higher salary by 50% than other nationalities had for the same work, meat, fat, and other products were received. They were allowed to create armed self-defense groups. Military units were formed of them. For example, in the Halbstadt area, 3 cavalry squadrons were created. Later, they were converted into self-defense units. The German researcher, Horst Gerlach, gives more complete information about these units. He reports about the 1st Cavalry Regiment of Ethnic Germans establishment in October 1942 in Molochna. This regiment operated in the Prishep-Molochna district and consisted of 750, 800 people. Look at this slide, please. The regiment covered the evacuation of Volksdeutsche to Germany in 1943. It fought against the Boche fighters. Later, it was joined to the 8th Cavalry Division of the SS Florian Geyer. Also, as a rule, Volksdeutsche representatives were recruited by the captains, burgomeisters, translators, police, and Gestapo agents. The life of ethnic Germans and Mennonites was regulated by special decisions. This involved virtually all spheres of their lives, for example, including regulation of issues such as marriage, names of the Mennonite population, school attendance by children, etc. By the way, schools functioned virtually in all the Mennonite settlements where they were before the war. They were visited by many children. In the 1942, the celebration of the 100th anniversary of the Khortytsa Central School was organized. Many of those who, for a number of reasons, were deprived of the right to teach by the Soviet authorities were involved to work in schools. One of the archives contains brief biographies of the teachers of the Khortytsa and Nikolai Field colonies of the occupation period who were able to return to teaching profession. Some of them graduated from teachers' colleges and technical colleges. They had given lessons before the revolution, including gymnasiums. They returned to teaching profession with a deep desire. The church life recovery was very important for the Mennonites. For the matter, both the Mennonite population of the occupied territories and the Nazi authorities had their own plans. The ethnic Germans had high hopes for the resumption of church life, as in the opinion of Richard Wald, the main connection of the colonies with German origin was the church and its life. Nazi leadership had their own hopes for the church. Thus, in the circular prepared by the Chief Directorate of Imperial Security in August 16, 1941, about the church question in the occupied areas of the Soviet Union, the Nazi special services were given three basic tasks. First, supporting the development of the religious movement as hostile to Bolshevism. Second, fragmenting it into separate currents in order to avoid the possible consolidation of guiding elements for the struggle against Germany. Third, church organization using to assist the German administration in the occupied territories. If the second task concerned mainly the activities of the Orthodox Church, the first and the third were entirely German and Mennonites. In the process of church resumption, there were some problems, such as the lack of priests, as many of them were repressed in the late 1930s. The conversion of church buildings during the years of Soviet power, many of them were used at clubs or agricultural buildings. For example, the natives of the village of Nieder-Khortytsa remember about the period of occupation. The church was reopened, although there was no preacher for some time. Before the war, grain was stored there, and after the war too. Before the church was closed, Dick was the prediger. He was repressed in 1937. But these problems were solved. Almost every Mennonite was familiar with the scriptures, and thus the role of pastor was performed by the most respected and well-known members of the community who were familiar with the religious canons. Also, most of buildings were redesigned, but they still are mostly preserved. Some of them have persisted to these days. Church life was gradually improving. For example, 5 Mennonite parishes were established in the Khortytsa colonies, and 1 parish was established in Nikolai Field. Churches were opening. German soldiers were taking part in divine services. In cases where the church building was destroyed, services were held in clubs, cinemas, or other suitable premises. By the way, occupation authorities sometimes closed other educational institutions when opening churches. For example, according to the testimony of old-timers in the former Mennonite village of Blumengard, the Mennonite church was restored from the beginning of the occupation, but the club and library were closed due to the ideological orientation of the literature stored there. A similar situation took place in another Mennonite settlement of Schönhorst. How did the Mennonite population react to this innovation and to the occupation regime in general? Part of the Mennonites went to cooperate with the invaders. That was in particular occupation administration service. The most vivid example, the regional chief of Hortica Joseph Epp activity. Mennonites served not only in administrative but also in punitive organs. Information about the work of the occupation punitive formation is provided by the materials of filtration cases. For example, they mention the gendarmes, policemen, security guard of the concentration camp. One of them, according to the witness words, beat Soviet citizens and transferred Soviet citizens to be shot. In June 1942, Dnipropetrovsk General Commissariat was visited by the Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories Rosenberg and the Reich Commissar of Ukraine Koch. Я сокращаю. I'm cut my report. I'm cut my report. No, the mark of the life of Mennonite in testimony of old-timers, former Mennonite villages. These are Ukrainian Bele, Shkrebitko. There are negative market to activity Mennonites, and there are and positive mark to activity of Mennonites. And yes, just a minute. It's true, it's true. We must take into account the fact that Germans and Mennonites had already lived for a century and a half in another environment, and it affected their way of thoughts and views of the world around them by the beginning of the war. By the time the war had been started, many Germans had already appeared, which could be called Soviet rather than Russians. They were born, grew up, brought up in the years of Soviet power. They were influenced by the school, public organizations, and they have already identified themselves not only in terms of nationality, but also in terms of their citizenship. So felt themselves to be citizens of the Soviet Union. For example, in political situation section of the semi-annual report by Karl Stumpf, which was sent to the Ministry for Occupied Eastern Territories on August 10, 1942, it was said, the Germans who suffered from Bolshevik propaganda for 20 years were not able to think the same way as the raised German from the Vaterland. In 1943, 44, Mennonites with almost all the German population were evacuated to the Poland, then in Germany. But even so they were Germans, they did not become insiders in Germany. They were still strangers anyway. And in the conditions of the retreat of the German army and moving of huge masses of the whole population throughout the country, they looked like a kind of burden, and the Reich government did not really like them. For example, in a transcript dated March 8, 1945, on a trip to Himmler, Joseph Goebbels writes, "A trip around Berlin shocked me. On the way, we found refugees, train convoys, primarily Germans from the Black Sea regions. Right mood false. What kind of people moved to the Reich under the Germans title?"